major article with the following headlines. Be ashamed. Salmon criticised over Russian TV link. RT launches show despite propaganda concerns. The former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, has a new discussion show on RT, the television channel which used to be known as Russia Today. What's more, Salmond scooped the entire British media with an interview with the deposed Catalan president, Carles Puigdemont. Why should Salmond be ashamed? What exactly are the Guardian's propaganda concerns? The implication of the Guardian article was that RT was a sinister force, that Alex Salmond had no right to his show, and that a mildly dissenting view of the world had no place in the media. Consider the irony. Here was the Guardian's media editor, Graham Ruddock, parroting disinformation, propaganda and smear, along with the suspicions, quote unquote, of Western security services. James Clapper, the former head of America's National Intelligence Agency, was quoted, "RT," said Clapper, "was a mouthpiece of Russian government propaganda." What the Guardian didn't tell us was that Clapper was the notorious liar who denied under oath to the US Congress that the NSA collected information on millions of Americans and millions of the rest of us, a fact that Edward Snowden revealed. Clapper later resigned, narrowly escaping charges of perjury. The Guardian also quoted that bastion of free speech, the British Foreign Office. The US Department of Justice was cited, even though no crime had been committed. The two demon words, Kremlin and Putin, adorn Mr. Ruddock's drivel. Such is the state of journalism, mainstream journalism, in 2017. What on earth is going on? If RT is the Kremlin's soft power, as the Guardian suggested, one wonders what the BBC is, with its long documented history of suppression, of doing the bidding of British governments, and of serving Western power. During the Irish War, the BBC banned, doctored, or delayed more than 50 major TV programs. Has RT performed such a censorial role? And there is the notoriety of the BBC's reporting of Iraq, but I shall come to that shortly. I also appear on RT from time to time. So do people of widely varying political views, from right to left. There's even a scattering of independent critical thinking, a quality now obsolete in the mainstream media. Unlike its mainstream competitors, there is no warmongering. How threatening RT's growing popularity must be. Imagine its brainwashed audience, people like myself, who now regard much of corporate news, from which people like myself have come, as unwatchable and unreadable. The term fake news was not invented by Donald Trump. Neither was it invented by social media. It was contrived and it has been reinforced by the liberal media in the United States and carried by the liberal media in the UK and in Europe. The aim clearly has been to deflect a growing public awareness of the media's long-time role as disseminators of state and vested interest propaganda, the very thing RT is accused of without evidence. So much is devoid of evidence these days, yet evidence is the root of real journalism. But who needs evidence when you're running a witch hunt? or a campaign of rumors and hearsay, when you're shouting j'accuse at people? Who needs the presumption of innocence? Who needs the right of reply, the demands of proof and natural justice? Who needs the rights that people have died fighting for since the Magna Carta? What matters, it seems, is indignation. The Russians did it. Putin did it. Kevin Spacey is guilty. The media has become a lynch mob. This is not fake news. This is fake journalism. 100 years ago, at the height of the imperial slaughter known as the First World War, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, shared a secret with the editor of the Manchester Guardian, which became The Guardian, C.P. Scott. If the people really knew the truth, he said, the war would be stopped tomorrow, but they don't know and they can't know, unquote. That principle of censorship by omission has ruled the mainstream media ever since. The BBC was founded on it, with Lord John Reith, its founder, secretly writing propaganda for the Tory government during a general strike. In 1945, the celebrated New York Times correspondent, W.H. Lawrence, set the post-war standard for collusion by lying about the true effects of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. His front-page story was headlined, "No radioactivity in Hiroshima ruin," unquote. It was fake news. 8 years later, the same distinguished newspaper ran a similar front-page story headline, "How Communists Took Control of Guatemala." It was fake news. The reporter was Sidney Grusin. He claimed that the Russians and local communists had taken control of the small Latin American state. Not only was this false, as the archives have long since shown, but the opposite was true. The United States, which had exploitative interests in Guatemala, had violently overthrown that country's first democratically elected reformist government. The president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, was stripped naked at the airport as he was thrown out of his own country. Today, this is known in Guatemala as the Great Crime. It was a crime that depended on the collusion of the media, of journalism. In 2009, researchers at the University of the West of England published a study that examined BBC reporting of Venezuela over more than a decade. Out of 304 BBC reports, only three mentioned any of the positive policies introduced by the democratically elected government of Hugo Chavez. There was almost nothing on Venezuela's historic initiatives, nothing on human rights legislation, nothing on food programs, healthcare initiatives, poverty reduction. The greatest literacy program in history received only passing reference. An unprecedented record of democratic elections was suppressed as if to show that Chavez somehow lacked electoral support. One BBC report compared him to Hitler. Venezuela is getting the treatment again. J'accuse. Venezuela has problems. The price of oil has collapsed. Chavez is dead. And the BBC, The Guardian, The Times, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and the rest are lined up like gravediggers to bury that flawed democracy that inspired millions of the world's poorest people and gave them hope. There are strict rules or designations imposed by the purveyors of real fake news, if that isn't a contradiction. To paraphrase the late Ed Herman, some news is worthy, other news is unworthy. Some victims are worthy, others are unworthy. In the 1990s, Western public opinion was groomed by the media for an illegal assault on Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic, semi-socialist federation independent of the United States and Europe, both of which wanted to exploit it, especially Germany. The Serbs were told that if they didn't agree to a NATO occupation and to convert their economy to the so-called free market, their country would be bombed. That was in an appendix. It wasn't reported throughout the West, appendix to a so-called peace agreement at the so-called Rambouillet peace talks. It was the kind of offer the mafia make. None of it was news. The destruction of Yugoslavia was a worthy cause. In the spring of 1999, the US Defense Secretary, William Cohen, claimed that the government in Belgrade had murdered 100,000 men from Kosovo. That was fake. David Sheffer, the US ambassador at large for war crimes, increased this figure to, and I quote, 225,000 ethnic Albanian men aged between 14 and 59. That was fake too. The British media took its cue from Tony Blair, who invoked the memory of the Holocaust and compared the people of Kosovo with the Jews under the Nazis. Flight from genocide, said the Daily Mail, echoes of the Holocaust, chorused the Sun and the Mirror. NATO bombers flew at high altitudes. They were mainly British and American aircraft, but Norwegian aircraft took part as well on this assault on another European country. Depleted uranium and cluster bombs were dropped on factories, bridges, schools, churches. At least 500 people were killed. How shameful it was. But surely mass graves in Kosovo would provide Britain, America, Norway with justification. International forensic teams swarmed over Kosovo. The FBI flew in to investigate what the media called the largest crime scene in the FBI's forensic history. The FBI found not a single mass grave and went home. The Spanish forensic team also returned home, with its leader complaining angrily that he and his colleagues had become part of, and I quote, a semantic pirouette by the war propaganda machines because we did not find one, not one, mass grave. The suffering of the people of Iraq were also designated an unworthy cause. During the 1990s, countless Iraqi men, women, and children died and suffered as a result of a medievalist blockade imposed by the United States, by the United Nations, in reality, by the United States and Britain. I saw the evidence and I filmed it. A true Holocaust had begun, including an epidemic of cancers caused by the use of depleted uranium in the first Gulf War. Iraqi hospitals were denied basic medicines, syringes, rubber gloves. When the UN humanitarian official Dennis Halliday resigned in protest, he was airbrushed from the media, or he was vilified. On the BBC, the famous presenter, Jeremy Paxman, shouted at him, "Aren't you just an apologist for Saddam Hussein?" The Guardian described this as one of Paxman's memorable moments. Paxman signed a £1 million book deal. The land invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a grotesque hoax, promoted by fabrications masquerading as news, as journalism, notably in the New York Times and the London Observer, both liberal newspapers. In 2009, I interviewed David Rose, the Observer journalist, whose reports claimed that Saddam Hussein was linked to al-Qaeda and 9/11 and had weapons of mass destruction. It was fake. Rose told me he'd been duped. "I can make no excuses," he said. "What happened in Iraq was a crime on a very large scale." I asked him, "Does that make journalists accomplices to war crimes?" "Yes," he replied. Such contrition is highly unusual. His newspaper never apologized. Its fawning over Blair was matched by that of its owner, The Guardian, where Blair's ascendancy was described as mythical. During the invasion of Iraq, I filmed a number of interviews with senior journalists in the United States and asked them what would have happened had the media challenged Bush's and Blair's lies instead of amplifying and echoing them. The renowned investigative journalist Charles Lewis and the former CBS anchor Dan Rather answered almost identically. "There is," said Lewis, "a very good chance we would have not have gone to war," unquote. In other words, 1 million people might have lived, 4 million people might not have fled their homes, a society might not have been dismembered, and the monstrous ISIS might not have appeared. In Britain, the propaganda role is often attributed to the right-wing tabloid press. But these have now become almost a parody, as their failed campaign against Jeremy Corbyn at the last British election demonstrated. The power of corporate media today rests in the liberal wing, notably the BBC and The Guardian, the New York Times and the Washington Post. These are respectable, they have credibility, and because they have credibility, their propaganda is the most believable and the most insidious. In 2011, the United States, France, Britain, and Norway, and the rest of NATO destroyed Libya. The principal weapon was fake news. NATO launched a total of 9,700 airstrikes and sorties, of which more than a third were aimed at civilian targets. The United Nations reported that, and I quote, "Most of the children killed were under the age of 10. The invasion of Libya and the murder of the Libyan president, Colonel Gaddafi, was justified by news that he was planning, quote, genocide against his own people in the city of Benghazi. We knew, said President Obama, that if we waited one more day, Benghazi could suffer a massacre that would have reverberated across the region and stained the conscience of the world, unquote. That was a lie, a fabrication cooked up by Islamist militias facing defeat by Libyan government forces. They told Reuters there would be, and I quote, a real bloodbath, a massacre like we saw in Rwanda, unquote. Reported on March the 14th, 2011, this provided the first spark for NATO's inferno. There was no massacre. Many of the rebels were secretly supplied and trained by Britain's SAS. Many of them went to Syria to join ISIS. Unknown to the British public, the intelligence agency MI5 had maintained Libyan terrorist assets in Manchester for 20 years. The suicide bomber allegedly responsible for the atrocity that killed 22 young people in Manchester last May was part of this anti-Gaddafi extremist group known as the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. For more than 20 years, it was cultivated and encouraged by MI5. Islamic extremism and the British government go back a long way. I recommend the new edition of the historian Mark Curtis's book, Secret Affairs. It will tell you what the news doesn't. This brings me back to Russia and Russiagate. Throughout the Cold War, we were told incessantly about a missile gap between the Russians and the United States. Russia was said to be ahead in the development of nuclear weapons. When a secret CIA report informed the White House that the Russians were actually far behind, a so-called Team B report was fabricated that put the Russians well ahead. This became front-page news, and it was fake. As a direct result, the Cold War was continued and more nuclear weapons were built and deployed. In 2017, here we go again. According to the hysteria currently sweeping Washington, the Russians are plotting to undermine the great American democracy. If satire wasn't dead, we'd be convulsing with laughter. In 2014, the US effectively overthrew its 56th government since the Second World War, many of them democracies. Do we know this? When Harold Pinter accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2005, he compared and contrasted our knowledge of the crimes of the Soviet Union, about which we know a great deal, with the crimes of America, of which, and I quote him, never happened. Nothing ever happened. Even while it was happening, it wasn't happening. It didn't matter. It was of no interest, unquote. In 2014, the Obama administration overthrew the elected government in Ukraine. The coup was led by Europe's most active Nazis. In the Western media, this was converted to a Russian invasion. The American coup never happened. It didn't matter. It was of no interest. Since that coup in Ukraine, the greatest buildup of military forces in modern times has taken place along Russia's western border and in the Baltics. Not since Hitler's invasion in 1941 have foreign troops presented such a demonstrable threat to Russia. Norway, which has shared a peaceful border with Russia for centuries, is taking part in these provocative actions. One of America's so-called, quote, defensive missile shields is planned for the high north. Why? Why are Norwegian troops in the Baltics commanded by American generals? Why are US Marines in Norway? If I was a Norwegian, I would want to know why a leaked NATO document says that nuclear weapons preparations, once classified as not advisable, are now, and I quote, conceivable. The United States is preparing for a war with Russia and possibly China. Many of the safeguards on first strikes have been lifted. The US is committed to spending $12 trillion on nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. That's $46 million an hour, every hour, 24 hours a day. Is that news? No, it's not. At present, only propaganda is news, but this can change overnight with the first miscalculation, the first mistake, the first missile. A triumph for fake news is the tragedy of Syria, as Julian mentioned. The bloodletting in that country is not yet over. The Russians have moved on from their military victory to diplomacy, bringing together Iran, Turkey, and the Syrian government. That's the news. You wouldn't know it. It didn't happen, it didn't matter. Question the propaganda that has consumed most of the reporting of Syria in the West, and it's likely you'll be witch-hunted, even called a Holocaust denier. The suffering of Aleppo in Syria was a crusade by the media, yet almost no Western reporter witnessed it. For news, they relied on so-called rebels, many of whom were foreign jihadists, backed by the US and British governments. But Aleppo is two cities. Western Aleppo, held by Syria, was blown to bits by jihadists, but its suffering was not news, didn't happen, didn't matter, was of no interest. Double standards are the pillars of fake news. Syria's Assad is a murderous official enemy, whereas the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, reports The Guardian, is running a positive revolution and is bursting with, and I quote, a zeal for reform, unquote, words that might have been written by Burson Marsteller, the notorious New York public relations firm hired by the Saudis to correct their barbaric image. The zeal for reform might have also included Saudi's zeal for buying British and American weapons with which to kill children in Yemen. In the UK, every day we read or hear the word austerity. To most British people, austerity means the collective economic punishment of them, of millions of ordinary people. Services, hospitals, local councils, benefits are all cut to the bone. But austerity is fake news, a political and media construct and invention. In 2008, following the great financial crash, a rotten empire of capital was exposed. Banks and leading bankers were revealed as crooked. That was the real news. But after a few months, the media message changed. The rotten empire of capital disappeared and the public were diverted by something called austerity, which meant that the debt of the banks and the corporate crooks had become the burden of ordinary people. Many of the premises of civilized life in Britain were dismantled. These so-called austerity cuts amounted to more than £83 billion, which was almost exactly the amount of tax avoided by the same crooked banks and by corporations such as Amazon and Rupert Murdoch's News UK. In other words, austerity was fake news, pure propaganda that promoted not economic necessity, but an extreme ideology known as neoliberalism. What I find hopeful is that people have begun to call the corporate media to account. Many of us no longer accept the arrogance and defensiveness of a media divinity that rarely has to account for itself. We need a new language in journalism, a new spirit that encourages young journalists to report the world from the ground up, not from the top down. At present, terrorism is always theirs, never ours. Extremists are those who attack us in our cities, never politicians whose decisions condemn thousands to death by bombing and by starvation in stricken countries like Yemen. We need to challenge the rise of public relations pretending to be journalism. We need to challenge fake zeitgeists, such as the obsession with look at me, which has nothing to do with personal liberation and everything to do with consumerism. A generation ago, a postmodern cult, now known as identity politics, signaled the demise of great collective movements against war, social injustice, and inequality. We need to reclaim the critical issue of class, and especially of the class that people serve, regardless of their gender, regardless of diversity. This applies as much to social media as it does to the mainstream. The only difference is the scale of manipulation.